Like a circle, the water cycle has no beginning or end. But since it's raining today, I thought we would start with precipitation. Precipitation is just water that falls out of the sky. And here in North Florida, it's almost always rain. Sometimes we might get a little snow or hail or some sleet, but most of the time it's rain. Once it falls from the sky, it can land in many different places, like on trees or other vegetation, directly on the ground, or into a water body like a lake, river, or ocean. Let's follow a water droplet as it falls from the sky and lands here in an ephemeral wetland. Ephemeral wetlands are a special kind of water body because they don't hold water year-round. And because they dry up, they don't provide very good habitat for fish. But there's some really cool organisms that do live in these ephemeral wetlands. In fact, there's a special group of amphibians that require isolated fishless wetlands in order to breed. I have a species right here that depends on ephemeral wetlands. It's called a gopher frog. Here's the tadpole. We don't want to keep tadpoles out of the water for long because they breathe through gills. Gopher frogs are really interesting amphibians. Like many ephemeral wetland breeding amphibians, they spend the majority of their life up in the uplands, even as far as a mile away from their breeding wetland. Gopher frogs actually like to hang out in gopher tortoise burrows, hence their name. This is a gopher tortoise burrow. A gopher tortoise is one of our 2 land turtle species in Florida. They build these burrows. Gopher frogs migrate down to their breeding wetland on cold, rainy nights. Once at the wetland, the males call to the females. Their call actually sounds like a snore. You can go to the Florida Museum of Natural History's website to hear the breeding call of the gopher frog, as well as many other frogs. Frog egg fertilization is external. In this picture, we have ornate chorus frogs reproducing. Ornate chorus frogs are also winter breeders, and they can only breed in ephemeral wetlands too, just like the gopher frog. The female releases her eggs into the water, and the male releases his sperm at the same time to fertilize them. This is called external fertilization. But back to gopher frogs. Gopher frog egg masses are really big. They can have 1,000 or 2,000 eggs. And the female attaches this egg mass to some kind of aquatic vegetation. The tadpoles hatch out of the eggs. And the tadpoles usually stay in the wetland for about 3 to 7 months before metamorphosing into a frog. It is so cool to see a frog in the process of metamorphosing. Here is a series of the life cycle and metamorphosing of those breeding ornate chorus frogs we saw earlier. The eggs hatch into tadpoles. The tadpoles live and grow and feed off algae. And when they're getting ready to metamorphose, they first sprout their front legs, then their back legs, and finally they absorb their tail and hop out on land. In a year or 2, they become fully mature adults and return to the wetland to breed. Some other amphibians that depend on ephemeral wetlands are oak toads, barking tree frogs, which are actually our largest native tree frog in Florida, little grass frogs, and these are the smallest frogs in North America. This one's sitting on a grass blade, so you can imagine how small it is. And there's a special salamander called a striped newt. Striped newts are really rare. In all the world, they can only be found in northern Florida and southern Georgia. In fact, they are declining in many parts of their range. but we at Coastal Plains Institute are working hard to bring them back to the wild. Together with many of our partners like Jacksonville Zoo and Gardens, maybe you've been over there, the Orion Center for Indigo Conservation, the Detroit Zoo, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, the U.S. Forest Service, and many more. We are captive breeding striped newts and releasing their young into the wetlands here in the Apalachicola National Forest. You can learn more about the striped newt repatriation project and hopefully come out on a field trip to see it in person one day on our website. The length of time that a wetland holds water is called its hydro period. Hydro meaning water, period meaning the length of time. Wetland hydro periods vary from wetland to wetland, but also within a single wetland from year to year. And it really depends on how much water is falling from the sky in a given season. There's also some other factors like how big the wetland is, how deep it is, and the underlying geology of the wetland. So where does all this water go? Water can percolate right down into the ground. This wetland here is located in a longleaf pine sandhill ecosystem. The soil is very sandy, which allows water molecules to filter right through the ground. Even though this wetland basin has a little more than sand, it's got some decaying organic matter too, water molecules can still filter and percolate right down into the ground. Where does the water go? To the aquifer! The aquifer is like a gigantic sponge in the ground that holds water. Our drinking water actually comes from wells that have been drilled down into the aquifer. Sometimes the water from the aquifer comes back up to the surface, and that's what we call a spring. In Florida, we have hundreds of springs. The water that comes out of the spring vents flows down the spring run into a river and eventually into the ocean. Another thing that happens to water in ephemeral wetlands has to do with plants. These plants, these shrubs right here are what we call dormant. It's winter time, there's no leaves on them. They're not photosynthesizing because the sun's energy isn't very high right now. But in a couple weeks, these button bushes will leaf out and they will start taking water from the soil up through their roots in order to photosynthesize. If you remember, photosynthesis takes energy from the sun, carbon dioxide, but also water. So they get that water from the soil, but also from the water in the wetland. Transpiration from plants and evaporation from land and water surfaces are the two main ways water molecules enter the atmosphere. Water vapor rises up on rising air currents, but the air gets cooler the higher up the water vapors travel, which then allows the water vapor to condense into clouds. Clouds drift around on air currents, sometimes over oceans, sometimes over land, and when the clouds get heavy enough, the water falls as precipitation and the cycle begins again. This is Rebecca Means from Coastal Plains Institute signing off for now. I hope you enjoyed your tour of the water cycle at an ephemeral wetland. And I look forward to meeting you soon and answering all your questions about amphibians and ephemeral wetlands and the water cycle.